Hi guys! Tonight we're stepping into the shadowed alleyways of Edo, Japan, where honour and madness dance on the edge of a blade. Drop your city and local time in the comments. It's fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle for that gentle glow, and let's walk together into a story so dark it makes modern horror films look like children's bedtime tales. You're standing in the bustling Yoshiwara district of Edo in Scene 03. The air, thick with incense and whispered promises. Cherry blossoms drift past paper lanterns that cast dancing shadows on wooden walls. But tonight, something feels wrong. The usual laughter from tea houses sounds forced, strained, like everyone's pretending not to notice the darkness creeping in. Your name is Yamamoto Jisuke, and you're about to witness the moment that transforms a respected samurai into Japan's most feared killer. The scent of jasmine tea mingles with something else, the metallic tang of future bloodshed that hangs in the air like a prophecy. Listen to the soft shuffle of silk slippers on bamboo floors. You're watching Matsudaira Nobutaka, a mid-ranking samurai with calloused hands and eyes that have seen too many battles. He's clutching a small lacquered box containing a jade hairpin worth 3 months' salary. His breathing is shallow, desperate. Tonight he's not a warrior. He's just a man terrified of rejection. The merchant's daughter, Okiku, glides through the room like moonlight on water. Her kimono patterns shift and flow, cranes taking flight, mountains shrouded in mist. She's 18, beautiful in that porcelain doll way that makes grown men forget their duties to their lords. Her laugh tinkles like wind chimes, but there's something else in her eyes. Calculation. She knows exactly what power she holds. Matsudaira approaches with the grace of a cat stalking prey. But you can see his hands trembling. The box containing the hairpin feels heavier than his katana. His voice, when he speaks, carries the weight of generations of samurai pride. Okiku-san, I come before you not as a warrior, but as a man whose heart beats only for you. The room falls silent. Even the geishas stop their shamisen playing. You can hear the distant sound of rain beginning to tap against the wooden shutters, nature itself holding its breath. Okiku's fan snaps shut with a sound like breaking bones. Her smile doesn't reach her eyes as she examines the offering. You're close enough to see the exact moment everything changes. Okiku's fingers trace the jade hairpin, then push it away with the casual indifference of someone swatting a fly. Her words slice through the humid air. Matsudaira-san, a warrior's heart is admirable, but a merchant's daughter dreams of more than just honour. Perhaps you should find someone more suitable to your station. The silence that follows is the kind that makes your skin crawl. Matsudaira's face doesn't change, samurai training. Keeps his expression stone still, but something behind his eyes shatters like thin ice. You watch his knuckles whiten as his hand instinctively moves toward his sword hilt. The other guests pretend to be absorbed in their sake, but everyone feels the shift in the air. What happens next unfolds in slow motion. Matsudaira bows deeply, formally, his movements precise as a tea ceremony. But when he straightens, you catch a glimpse of something that makes your blood freeze. His smile is perfectly polite, perfectly controlled, and absolutely terrifying. It's the smile of a man who has just decided that honour matters less than revenge. The rain outside grows heavier, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Okiku has already turned away, dismissing him as completely as if he were a servant. She's laughing with another admirer, a wealthy rice merchant's son whose hands have never held anything sharper than a brush. The sound of her laughter now grates like metal on stone. You follow Matsudaira as he leaves, noting how his gait has changed. No longer the careful, respectful steps of a courtship. Now he moves with the predatory grace of a hunting wolf. Outside, the narrow streets of Edo glisten with rain and lantern light. Steam rises from the wet cobblestones, creating ghostly wisps that seem to whisper warnings no one will heed. In the shadows between buildings, Matsudaira stops. His reflection wavers in a puddle, distorted and dark. When he speaks to himself, his voice carries a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. If she values station over honour, then perhaps it's time to show her what a samurai's true worth looks like. The stage is set. A woman's casual cruelty has awakened something monstrous in a man trained to kill. Tomorrow the streets will run red with consequences. You're still in the rain-soaked streets of Edo, but now you're following Matsudaira as he makes his way to the one place where wounded samurai go to either find wisdom or lose their minds completely. The temple of Zenkoji rises before you like a dark mountain, its curved roofs cutting against the storm clouds. The smell of burning incense can't quite mask something else, the scent of obsession taking root. Thunder rumbles overhead as you climb the stone steps. Each footfall echoes like a heartbeat, irregular and urgent. Matsudaira's straw sandals slap against wet stone, the sound mixing with the rhythmic chanting of monks somewhere in the temple's depths. But their prayers tonight feel hollow, like words spoken into an empty well. Inside the main hall, candlelight flickers across statues of Buddha that seem to watch with disapproving eyes. Matsudaira kneels before the altar, but his prayer isn't one of forgiveness or enlightenment. His words come out in a harsh whisper that makes the shadows seem to lean closer. Great Buddha, you teach that suffering comes from desire. Tonight, I have learned that humiliation comes from having desires denied by those beneath you. Listen to the way his voice cracks on the word beneath. You're witnessing the exact moment when social order, the foundation of Edo society, begins to crumble in one man's mind. His fingers trace the pommel of his wakizashi, the shorter sword that every samurai carries. The metal feels cold even through the silk wrapping, like touching winter itself. An elderly monk approaches, his bare feet silent on the polished wood floor. His name is Kogan, and his eyes hold the kind of calm that comes from decades of meditation. But even he seems unsettled by the energy radiating from the kneeling samurai. "Matsudaira-san," he says softly. "The night storms pass. Morning always brings clarity." Matsudaira's laugh is like glass breaking. "Clarity, honoured monk? I have perfect clarity." A merchant's daughter, barely old enough to understand the value of jade, thinks herself above a samurai whose ancestors served the shogun for 12 generations. The order of things has been inverted. You watch as Matsudaira draws his wakizashi, not to threaten, but to perform a ritual that makes your skin crawl. The blade gleams in the candlelight as he pricks his thumb, letting 3 drops of blood fall onto the temple floor. The sound they make hitting the wood is barely audible, but in the silence it sounds like thunder. "I swear by the blood of my ancestors," he whispers, "that this insult will not stand. If honour means nothing to merchants and their daughters, then perhaps they need to learn what dishonour truly costs." The monk Kogan backs away, recognizing something in the samurai's voice that transcends mere anger. This is the sound of a man writing his own name in history's darkest pages. The storm outside intensifies, rain lashing against the temple walls like angry spirits demanding entry. But inside, the air has gone completely still. Even the candle flames stop flickering as if the very elements are holding their breath. Matsudaira sheathes his blade and stands, but his movements have changed again. Now he moves like liquid death. You follow him as he leaves the temple, noting how other late-night visitors step aside without knowing why. Dogs cower in doorways. Cats flee from his path. Animals sense what humans cannot, that this man has crossed a line from which there is no return. The rain seems to avoid him now, as if even nature recognizes that something unclean walks among the living. In a narrow alley behind a noodle shop, Matsudaira stops at a small shrine dedicated to Inari, the fox god. But he's not here to pray. Hidden behind the offerings of rice and sake is something else. A list written in his careful calligraphy. Names. 20 names. All women who have, in his twisted logic, shown disrespect to samurai honour over the years. Okiku's name sits at the top, written in darker ink than the others. Below her, the tea-house owner who once laughed at a samurai's poetry, the silk merchant's wife who refused to bow deeply, enough. The geisha who chose a farmer's son over a warrior's proposal. Each name represents not just a woman, but a perceived crack in the natural order that Matsudaira has decided must be sealed with blood. His finger traces each name like a prayer bead, and with each touch his breathing becomes more rhythmic, more controlled. This isn't madness. It's something far worse. It's methodical, calculated revenge dressed up as righteous justice. The scariest monsters are always the ones who believe they're heroes. As you watch him fold the list and place it close to his heart, you realise the awful truth. Tomorrow isn't just about punishing Okiku for her rejection. It's about sending a message to every woman in Edo that the old ways, where samurai stood above all others, will be preserved through terror if they cannot be maintained through respect. The rain finally stops, but the silence that follows is more ominous than any storm. Dawn breaks over Edo like a wound in the sky, all reds and purples that seem to bleed into the morning mist. You're crouched on a rooftop watching as the city slowly awakens, unaware that this ordinary Tuesday will become a day whispered about in fearful tones for generations. The smell of cooking rice and fish drifts up from the streets below, mixing with something else, the metallic scent of impending violence that only you seem to notice. Matsudaira emerges from his modest lodgings, dressed not in his finest kimono, but in the dark, practical clothes of a man about to do terrible work. His swords are pristine, freshly sharpened, and oiled until they gleam like mirrors. But it's his face that tells the real story, calm as still water, with eyes that hold all the warmth of winter stone. You follow him through the narrow streets of the merchant quarter, where wooden shops line the paths like crooked teeth. Early vendors are setting up their stalls, calling out prices for fresh fish and vegetables in voices that will soon fall silent in horror. A group of women walks ahead, friends heading to the morning market, their cheerful chatter about fabric prices and their children's marriages floating on the cool air. Listen to the soft whisper of silk against silk as they move. Their hair is arranged in elaborate styles that took hours to perfect, held in place with pins and ornaments that catch the morning light. They have no idea they're walking into a nightmare carefully orchestrated by a man who believes their very existence is an insult to his honour. Matsudaira's hand rests on his katana hilt with the casual ease of a master craftsman preparing his tools. His breathing is controlled, meditative, like a monk entering prayer. But this isn't spiritual preparation. It's the focused calm of a predator selecting his prey. The first woman on his list, the tea house owner named Yuki, lives just around the next corner. You watch as he approaches her small shop where she's arranging delicate ceramic cups on bamboo shelves. Her movements are graceful, practiced, the result of years perfecting the art of serving tea to demanding customers. She hums a seasonal song under her breath, something about cherry blossoms and new beginnings. The irony is so sharp it could cut. The morning light streaming through her paper windows creates dancing patterns on the floor, beautiful and peaceful. Steam rises from the tea kettle, creating ghostly wisps that seem to whisper warnings. But Yuki is absorbed in her work, completely unaware that death itself is standing in her doorway, waiting for the perfect moment. Matsudaira's voice, when he speaks, is polite and formal, the tone a customer might use when requesting her finest tea. "Yuki-san, I require your services this morning." She turns with a professional smile that falters slightly when she sees something in his eyes. Animals recognize predators instinctively. Humans have to learn. "Of course, Honorable Samurai," she says, bowing deeply. "Please, be seated. I have just prepared fresh gi okuro, the finest leaves from the southern mountains." Her hand shakes slightly as she reaches for a cup, though she doesn't yet understand why. The primitive part of her brain is screaming warnings that her civilized mind refuses to hear. You're close enough to see the exact moment the mask slips from Matsudaira's face. "I remember you, Yuki-san, 2 summers ago, when my poetry was not to your refined taste, when you laughed at verses that had been praised by Lord Matsudaira himself." His voice remains perfectly level, conversational, which makes the words infinitely more terrifying. Yuki's face goes pale as understanding dawns. The teacup slips from her fingers, shattering on the wooden floor with a sound like breaking bones. Green tea spreads across the boards like spilled blood, staining everything it touches. Her mouth opens to scream, to plead, to explain, but no sound comes. Fear has stolen her voice. The blade slides from its sheath with the whisper-soft sound of steel on silk. In the morning light it gleams like captured moonlight, beautiful and terrible. Matsudaira's movements are precise, economical. There's no rage here, no passion, just the cold efficiency of a craftsman performing familiar work. What happens next unfolds in heartbeats. The first cut is quick, clinical, designed to prevent screaming rather than to kill. The second is deeper, more deliberate. By the third, Yuki's struggles have ceased, and the morning light streaming through the windows illuminates a scene that will haunt the nightmares of everyone who finds it. Matsudaira cleans his blade on her finest silk cloth, the one she saved for special customers, before resheathing it with the same care a calligrapher shows when putting away his brush. One name crossed off his list. 19 to go. The sun climbs higher, and somewhere in the distance a temple bell begins to toll. Not in celebration of the new day, but as if the very metal knows that something sacred has been broken forever. You're moving through Edo's central marketplace now, where the scent of fresh fish mingles with incense from nearby shrines and the underlying copper tang of spilled blood that only you seem to detect. The morning crowd grows thicker, merchants hawking their wares, housewives bargaining for the day's meals, children darting between stalls like minnows through reeds. None of them realise they're sharing the streets with a predator who sees their very existence as an offence against the natural order. Matsudaira walks among them like a ghost, his dark clothing helping him blend with the shadows cast by hanging banners and fabric awnings. His second target runs a small stall selling silk scarves and hair ornaments, luxury items that allow common women to dress above their station. Her name is Hanae, and in Matsudaira's twisted logic, she represents everything wrong with Edo's changing social hierarchy. Listen to the sound of coins changing hands, the rustle of silk being examined by careful fingers, the soft negotiations between buyer and seller. It's the soundtrack of commerce, of a society where money increasingly matters more than birthright. Each transaction is another nail in the coffin of samurai relevance, and Matsudaira hears every one. Hanae is perhaps 30, with the kind of practical beauty that comes from years of hard work and careful attention to detail. Her fingers are stained with dyes from fabric, and her back aches from long hours bent over her sewing. She's built this small business from nothing, taking pride in creating beautiful things that make ordinary women feel extraordinary for a few precious moments. You watch as she helps a young mother select a hair ornament for her daughter's coming-of-age ceremony. The woman's face lights up as she imagines how beautiful her child will look, how proud the family will be. It's a moment of pure human connection, of hope for the future. Matsudaira sees it as corruption, commoners pretending to nobility through purchased finery. He approaches the stall with the same terrible calm he showed at the tea house. "Hanae-san, your scarves are renowned throughout the district." His voice carries the formal politeness that makes Japanese conversation sound like verbal dancing, but underneath lurks something that makes nearby shoppers unconsciously step away. "You honour me, Samurai-sama," Hanae replies, bowing deeply. Her instincts are better than Yuki's were. She senses danger immediately. But in Edo's rigid social structure, refusing to serve a samurai isn't just rude, it's potentially fatal. She's trapped between propriety and survival, unaware that both paths lead to the same destination. Matsudaira's hand trails across her finest silk, a bolt of midnight blue shot through with silver threads that shimmer like starlight. "Tell me, Hanae-san, do you ever wonder if perhaps your customers reach too high? If beauty should be reserved for those born to appreciate it?" His fingers tighten on the fabric and you can see the knuckles whiten. The question hangs in the air like poisonous smoke. Hanae's eyes dart toward the crowd, seeking help that won't come. In daylight, surrounded by dozens of people, she's still utterly alone with a madman whose concept of justice died with his pride. I serve whoever can pay, Samurai-sama. Commerce knows no bloodlines," she whispers. "Wrong answer." Matsudaira's smile is winter itself. Commerce. Yes, the great leveller that makes a merchant's daughter think herself equal to a samurai's honour. The blade appears in his hand as if materialised from shadow, moving so quickly that several seconds pass before Hanae realises what she's seeing. The marketplace erupts in screams, but they're not screams of horror yet, just the startled cries of people diving for cover as steel flashes in the morning sun. Matsudaira moves with surgical precision, each cut calculated to send a message. This isn't mindless slaughter. It's performance art written in blood and terror. A fish vendor drops his knife and flees, leaving silver scales scattered across cobblestones that are rapidly turning red. A child's wooden toy clatters forgotten as her mothers grab their little ones and run. But you notice something else. Some of the fleeing crowd includes other merchants, other women who suddenly realise they might be next on a list they didn't know existed. When the screaming stops, Hanae lies among her scattered silks, the midnight blue fabric now stained with darker shades. Her hair ornaments are scattered like fallen stars, beautiful and useless. Matsudaira methodically wipes his blade clean before surveying his handiwork with the hands. Satisfaction of a craftsman admiring his latest creation. 2 down, 18 to go. But something has changed in the marketplace dynamic. Word is spreading through the district faster than wildfire. A samurai has declared war on women who forget their place. Some flee immediately. Others gather in groups, seeking safety in numbers. None of them understand that groups only make the hunting more efficient. You follow Matsudaira as he disappears into the labyrinth of side streets, noting how his breathing remains steady, controlled. He's not worked up by the violence. If anything, he seems calmer now, as if finally acting on his twisted convictions has brought him a kind of peace. The most dangerous killers are always the ones who believe they're saving the world. The news travels through Edo's narrow streets like plague wind, carried by breathless messengers and terrified witnesses who can barely speak through their chattering teeth. You're perched on a second-story balcony, watching the city transform from a bustling centre of commerce into something resembling a battlefield preparing for siege. Below, women clutch their children closer, men grip their walking sticks like weapons, and even the stray dogs seem to sense that predator and prey have been clearly defined. Matsudaira has vanished into the maze of back alleys and abandoned buildings that honeycombs the old district, but his presence haunts every shadow. You can feel him moving through the city like a shark through bloody water, methodical and patient. His third target is Machiko, a widow who runs a small sake brewery. A woman who dared to continue her dead husband's business instead of remarrying or retreating to a convent as tradition demands. Listen to the sound of wooden shutters slamming closed, the frantic whispers of neighbours sharing warnings, the hurried footsteps of people who suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. The normal soundtrack of Edo, street vendors calling their wares, children playing games, the rhythmic clacking of looms, has been replaced by the tense silence of a city holding its breath. The magistrate's office buzzes with activity as officials try to piece together a pattern from the carnage. Doshin patrol officers cluster around a low table covered with reports written in careful calligraphy, each character describing horrors that seem to spring from the darkest folk tales. But this isn't supernatural evil. It's something far more terrifying. It's human logic twisted into monstrous shapes. The first victim laughed at his poetry, but, mutters one officer, a grizzled man whose hands shake as he reaches for his teacup. The second sold luxury goods to commoners. What's the connection? He doesn't yet understand that in Matsudaira's mind, both women committed the same crime, existing in a world where samurai authority could be questioned or ignored. Meanwhile, in the shadowed interior of Machiko's brewery, the widow works alone among the fermenting vats, their contents bubbling and hissing like living things. She's heard the rumours, seen the fear in her customers' eyes, but business doesn't stop for madmen. The rice wine must be tended, barrels must be cleaned, accounts must be balanced. Life goes on until it doesn't. You slip inside through a loose board, noting how the air tastes of yeast and alcohol and something else. The metallic scent that now follows Matsudaira like a signature. He's already here, crouched behind a massive oak barrel, watching Machiko work with the same focused intensity the hunter shows when studying deer movements before the kill. Machiko hums while she works, the old drinking song her husband used to sing during harvest festivals. Her movements are economical, practiced, the result of years learning a trade that was never meant for women. She's proud of what she's built, proud of honouring her husband's memory by keeping his legacy alive. In Matsudaira's worldview, this makes her doubly guilty. When he emerges from the shadows, Machiko doesn't scream. Instead, she reaches for a wooden ladle, not as a weapon, but as a tool of her trade. "You're here about the sake," she says quietly. "I've heard what you've done. What I don't understand is why." Her voice is steady, resigned. She's already accepted her fate, which somehow makes the coming violence even more obscene. You understand perfectly, Matsudaira replies, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. You're a woman playing at being a man, running a business that should have passed to your husband's brother or been sold to a proper merchant. Instead, you mock his memory by pretending you can fill his place. The logic is so warped it could only make sense to someone whose mind has snapped. Machiko's laugh is bitter as the dregs in an empty cup. His brother sold the family into debt gambling on cockfights. The proper merchants offered me half what the business was worth, knowing I had no choice but to accept. I saved this place through my own sweat and blood, and I'll be damned if I apologise for it. Her defiance is magnificent and utterly futile. The third killing unfolds in the dense, yeasty air of the brewery, surrounded by the tools of the honest labour and the fruits of careful planning. When it's over, the fermenting vats continue their quiet bubbling, indifferent to the violence that has stained their wooden flanks. Matsudaira takes a moment to taste Machiko's sake. It's excellent, which somehow makes her death feel like greater waste. 3 down, 17 names remaining on the list that grows heavier with each crossing out. But something else is building in Edo's streets, a different kind of fermentation, as fear begins to transform into something more dangerous. Anger. The hunter may soon discover he's created other predators, and some of them know these streets far better than any Ronin samurai. Outside, the temple bells begin tolling in an irregular pattern, not marking time, but sending warnings that anyone who knows the old codes can understand. The city is mobilizing. You're following a network of whispered communications that flows through Edo like an underground river, carrying news and warnings between the district's most vulnerable residents. Servants pass messages to merchants' wives, who relay them to geishas, who share them with tea-house workers, who warn seamstresses and silk weavers. It's a web of feminine solidarity that Matsudaira never anticipated, women protecting women through information and cunning rather than steel. The 4th name on his list belongs to Sachiko, a calligraphy teacher who committed the unforgivable sin of correcting a samurai student's brush technique in front of other pupils. Her small school occupies the upper floor of a converted warehouse, where young women come to learn the delicate art of transforming thoughts into beautiful characters. Today the building feels like a fortress under siege. Listen to the soft scratch of brushes on rice paper, the gentle murmur of instruction, the quiet confidence of women mastering skills traditionally reserved for men. But underneath these normal sounds, you detect something else. The whispered strategies of people who refuse to die. Quietly. These aren't helpless victims anymore. They're becoming something more dangerous. Sachiko moves among her students with fluid grace, her own calligraphy so perfect it seems to float above the paper, rather than rest upon it. But her eyes constantly dart to the windows, and her free hand never strays far from the long, thin brush that could serve as a weapon if necessary. She's heard what happened to Yuki, Hanae, and Machiko. She knows she's next. You slide through the building's shadows, noting the preparations her students have made. Inkstones positioned near doorways, heavy enough to crack skulls, paper screens arranged to create blind spots and confusion, tea braziers that could splash boiling water. These women may not have swords, but they possess something potentially more valuable. The desperation of people with nothing left to lose. Matsudaira circles the building like a wolf testing a fortress, searching for the optimal point of entry. His calm has developed hairline cracks. The previous killings were easy because his victims were isolated, unprepared. Now he faces organised resistance, and something approaching doubt flickers in his eyes. But doubt and sanity are luxuries he abandoned when he wrote that list in blood. The attack comes at the changing of the hour when temple bells mask the sound of splintering wood. Matsudaira moves through the doorway like liquid death, his blade already singing its steel song. But instead of screams and confusion, he's met with coordinated resistance. Hot tea scalds his sword arm, inkstones fly like black meteors, paper screens tangle around his legs. Sachiko doesn't run. Instead, she positions herself between Matsudaira and her youngest student, a girl barely 15 whose calligraphy shows promise of real artistry. "You want to punish me for teaching pride to women," she says, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Look at them! Look what you've created! We're not afraid of you anymore." For the first time, Matsudaira hesitates. The resistance isn't changing his mind. His madness runs too deep for that. But it's forcing him to confront the possibility that his crusade might create the very disorder he claims to oppose. Women united in defiance, men questioning samurai authority, the old hierarchies crumbling not from above but from below. The fight that follows is brutal and desperate. But when the morning light filters through torn paper screens, Sachiko lies among scattered brushes and spilled ink that mingles with darker stains. Yet her death feels different from the others. Not the execution of a helpless victim, but the fall of a warrior who chose her battlefield and died defending what she loved. 4 down. But as Matsudaira flees the scene, leaving behind a classroom transformed into a shrine to resistance, you notice something crucial. Several students escaped, carrying with them not just their lives, but something more valuable. Proof that the hunter could be wounded, that his terrible certainty could be shaken. Word of the failed ambush will spread as quickly as news of the murders themselves. In the distance, the rhythmic pounding of taiko drums begins, not the ceremonial beating that marks festivals, but the urgent war rhythm and that once summoned samurai to battle. Someone with authority is taking this threat seriously. The hunt is about to become a war, and wars have a way of consuming everyone who participates in them, predator and prey alike. The sun climbs higher, but instead of bringing clarity, it illuminates a city where shadows seem to move with their own purpose, where every alley might hide death or salvation, and where the line between hunter and hunted grows thinner with each drop of spilled blood. You're seated in the dim interior of the magistrate's office, where officials struggle to comprehend a crime that doesn't fit their careful categories of human behaviour. Paper screens filter the morning light into geometric patterns that dance across low tables covered with witness reports, crime scene sketches, and increasingly desperate correspondence to higher authorities. The air smells of green tea, fear sweat, and the sandalwood incense burning before a small shrine where prayers are offered for wisdom that seems reluctant to arrive. Magistrate Hayashi Razan sits in formal Caesar position, but his perfect posture can't hide the tension radiating from his compact frame. He's served Edo's legal system for 20 years, dealing with everything from rice thieves to ronin duels, but nothing has prepared him for a killer who murders according to some twisted code of social correction. His fingers trace the characters of each victim's name as if the written words might reveal secrets the spoken testimonies have not. Listen to the soft shuffle of sandaled feet as Daishin officers come and go, each bearing fresh reports that only deepen the mystery. The sound of urgent whispers, the scratch of brushes on paper, the occasional sharp intake of breath as new evidence reveals the scope of Matsudaira's plan. 4 women dead, but the pattern suggests this is merely the opening movement of a longer, more terrible symphony. "Honourable Magistrate," ventures Officer Kumagai, a thin man whose nervous habit of adjusting his cap betrays his anxiety. The witnesses describe a samurai of middle years, perhaps 35, with the bearing of someone trained in formal sword schools. His technique is precise, suggesting regular practice, but his targets... He trails off, unable to articulate the randomness that isn't random at all. Hayashi's response comes slowly, weighted with the responsibility of protecting a city from a predator who follows rules no sane person can understand. His targets represent something to him, not just individuals, but symbols of some perceived disorder. The tea-house owner who mocked poetry, the merchant who sold above her station, the widow who refused to accept traditional limitations, the teacher who dared correct a samurai's technique. The pieces of Matsudaira's twisted logic begin forming a horrifying picture in the magistrate's mind. This isn't madness in the traditional sense. It's ideology weaponized into systematic murder. The killer sees himself as a reformer, using terror to restore what he believes is proper social order. Understanding his motivation makes stopping him both easier and infinitely more difficult. You watch as messengers arrive with news from across the district. Shop owners are closing early, wealthy families are hiring additional guards, and several prominent merchants have quietly left the city until the crisis passes. But it's the other news that makes Hayashi's face go pale. Reports of women organising into groups, sharing information, preparing defences. The cure threatens to become as disruptive as the disease. "Sir," interrupts another officer, bowing deeply before delivering his report, "we've received word from the Rice Merchants Guild. They're demanding we post guards at every business owned by a woman. The silk weavers want us to arrest every samurai in the district for questioning. And the sake brewers, he swallows hard, they've hired their own security. Armed men with no official authority patrolling our streets. Hayashi closes his eyes, seeing the nightmare that's unfolding. Matsudaira's crusade isn't just killing individuals, it's poison spreading through the social fabric, turning neighbour against neighbour, class against class. The very order the killer claims to protect is crumbling under the weight of his methods. How many more names do we think he has? The magistrate asks quietly. The answer comes from an unexpected source, a young woman who enters the office with the measured steps of someone who has survived horror and transformed it into determination. She's one of Sachiko's escaped students, her ink-stained fingers trembling slightly as she produces a carefully copied list. Honourable Magistrate, before Sachiko-sensei died, she made me memorize the names he spoke. 20 women. 20 reasons why the world needs correcting. The list she recites makes everyone in the room understand the true scope of the crisis. Not just random victims, but a systematic targeting of women who represent different aspects of social change. Entrepreneurs, artists, teachers, leaders. Matsudaira isn't just killing individuals, he's trying to murder the future itself. One powerful woman at a time. As you absorb the full horror of the plan, you notice something else developing in the magistrate's office. Determination. Fear is transforming into resolve. Chaos into organisation. Maps are being unrolled, patrol routes planned, resources allocated. The system that seemed helpless against a single madman is finally beginning to fight back. But outside, in the streets of Edo, Matsudaira continues his methodical work. The 5th name on his list belongs to a woman who dared to write poetry under her own name rather than ghosting it for male relatives. Her small house sits in a quiet district where cherry trees line the streets, their pink blossoms falling like tears from a grieving sky. You're walking through the Honjo district where literary salons flourish like hidden gardens, places where words are crafted with the same care other artisans bring to silk or steel. The air here carries different scents, the woody smell of quality paper, the sharp tang of fresh ink, the subtle incense that poets believe aids inspiration. But today, these refined aromas mix with something else, the copper taste of fear that has settled over the district like morning fog. Matsudaira moves through these scholarly streets like a plague spirit, his presence somehow dimming the soft light that filters through paper lanterns. His 5th target is Tomoe, a poet whose crime was publishing verses under her own name rather than attributing them to her deceased father. In the killer's twisted logic, this represents the ultimate female presumption, claiming credit for thoughts that should rightfully belong to men. Listen to the soft rustle of pages being turned, the gentle murmur of voices discussing metre and metaphor, the scratch of brushes as students copy their master's techniques. Tomoe's small salon occupies a converted tea house where aspiring poets gather to share their work and receive guidance. Today the usual dozen students has dwindled to 3, 2 elderly women too stubborn to be intimidated, and 1 young man whose devotion to his teacher outweighs his concern for personal safety. Tomoe herself sits in perfect Caesar position, her back straight as bamboo despite the danger she knows approaches. At 43, she's lived long enough to understand that some principles are worth dying for. Her latest collection of poems lies open before her, verses about the changing seasons, the loneliness of widowhood, the quiet strength found in women's daily struggles. Words that have moved thousands of readers but that one man considers abominations. You slip into the salon through a gap in the sliding doors, noting how the space has been subtly prepared for violence. Poetry books positioned to block sight lines, inkstones within easy reach, the brazier positioned so that its coals could be scattered as a weapon of last resort. Even in this refined world of literary discussion, the reality of impending death has forced practical considerations. "Sensei," whispers one of the elderly women, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind chimes hanging in the garden. "Perhaps we should close today. The streets grow more dangerous with each passing hour." Her hands shake as she holds her brush, forming characters that waver like leaves in a storm. Tomoe's response comes with the calm authority of someone who has found peace with their fate. If poets cannot write when the world grows dark, then when will poetry matter most? Our words outlive our bodies, Keiko-san. Let us ensure we leave something worthy behind. She dips her brush in fresh ink and continues working on a poem about cherry blossoms falling in unexpected seasons. The attack, when it comes, unfolds with the terrible inevitability of classic tragedy. Matsudaira enters through the garden, his footsteps silent on the stone path that winds between carefully pruned shrubs and ornamental rocks. His reflection wavers in the small pond where golden carp swim in lazy circles, oblivious to the violence about to stain their peaceful world. "Tomoe-san," he says, his voice carrying the formal politeness that makes Japanese conversation sound like verbal poetry. "Your verses are much admired, particularly the ones you claim as your own creation." The words hang in the air like incense smoke, beautiful and poisonous simultaneously. Tomoe doesn't look up from her writing. Instead, she finishes the character she's forming, the symbol for courage, before setting down her brush and meeting her killer's eyes. "They are my creation, Matsudaira-san. Every word born from my own thoughts, my own experiences, my own heart. If that offends you, then you understand nothing about the true nature of art." What follows unfolds in the hushed atmosphere of the salon, surrounded by centuries of accumulated wisdom and beauty. But when morning light finally penetrates the paper screens, it illuminates a scene that transforms poetry into tragedy. Tomoe lies among scattered poems, her blood mixing with spilled ink to create patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't so horrific. 5 down, 15 in names remaining. But as Matsudaira flees the scene, you notice something significant. The young male student escaped, carrying with him not just the memory of his teacher's death, but several of her unpublished poems. Her words will survive, spread, inspire others to resist the kind of thinking that demanded her silence. In the distance, the sound of approaching footsteps, not the measured tread of individual patrols, but the coordinated march of a larger force. The magistrate's office has finally organised a proper response. The hunt is becoming a siege, and even the most skilled predator can be overwhelmed by sufficient prey working in coordination. The war for Edo's soul has begun in earnest. You're perched on a rooftop overlooking the maze of narrow streets where Matsudaira has gone to ground, like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Below, a carefully orchestrated manhunt unfolds with the precision of a military campaign. Doshin officers move in coordinated patterns, blocking escape routes while volunteer guards, many of them women who refuse to cower in their homes, watch from strategic positions. The hunter is about to discover what it feels like to be prey. The morning sun climbs higher, casting sharp shadows that seem to shift and move with their own purpose. From your elevated position, you can see the net tightening. Around the old warehouse district where abandoned buildings provide perfect hiding spots for someone who needs to plan his next moves carefully. But Matsudaira has underestimated how quickly fear can transform into organised resistance when people realise they're fighting for their lives. Listen to the coordinated signals passing between search teams, the soft call of a temple bell, the rhythmic tapping of bamboo sticks, the whispered passwords that identify friend from potential foe. The women of Edo have learned to communicate in codes their attacker never anticipated, creating an intelligence network that flows information faster than any individual can move through the city's labyrinthine streets. Matsudaira emerges from his latest hiding place like a ghost materializing from shadow, but his legendary composure shows fresh cracks. 5 successful kills should have solidified his sense of righteous purpose, but instead he faces a city that refuses to submit to his vision of proper order. The resistance has evolved beyond individual defiance into something that threatens everything he believes about natural hierarchy. His 6th target should be easy: Midori, an elderly woman who runs a small pharmacy and has the audacity to diagnose ailments typically reserved for male doctors. Her shop sits in a narrow alley between a sack brewery and a fish market, normally isolated, enough for a quick, quiet kill. But today the alley buzzes with activity as neighbours and customers form an impromptu guard rotation. You follow Matsudaira as he circles the pharmacy, noting how his movement patterns have changed. Gone is the confident stride of a predator certain of his dominance. Now he moves with the careful, measured steps of someone who knows the terrain has shifted against him. Every shadow might hide an ambush, every friendly face might conceal an enemy. The pharmacy itself has been transformed into a fortress of community solidarity. Midori continues grinding herbs and mixing medicines, but she's surrounded by a human shield of people who've decided that some things matter more than personal safety. Young mothers whose children she's healed, elderly men whose joints she's eased, merchants whose headaches she's cured, all united in the understanding that her knowledge makes their lives better. "He's coming," whispers a lookout positioned near the alley entrance. Same height, same bearing as the descriptions, moving carefully, checking corners like a soldier. The warning passes from mouth to mouth in the space of heartbeats, and suddenly the seemingly casual gathering transforms into something more purposeful. Matsudaira's approach is methodical, professional, but when he turns the final corner he faces something unprecedented in his killing spree. Open defiance backed by numbers. Midori stands in her doorway, flanked by 24 neighbours who clutch everything from kitchen knives to wooden clubs. Their faces show for fear, but it is fear mixed with determination and something else. Righteous anger. "Matsudaira-san," Midori says, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has spent decades healing rather than harming. "You come to my home seeking to punish me for practicing medicine. But look around you. Look at the faces of people I've helped, lives I've saved, pain I've eased. Which of us serves society better?" For the first time in his campaign of terror, Matsudaira hesitates. Not from doubt about his mission, but from tactical uncertainty. He's killed isolated individuals, not armed groups prepared to fight back. His code of honour prevents him from striking down random bystanders, but his twisted logic demands Midori's death. The contradiction creates a moment of frozen indecision. That moment proves fatal to his mission, if not his life. The sound of approaching footsteps, official footsteps, echoes from both ends of the alley as a magistrate forces arrive in coordinated fashion. Matsudaira finds himself trapped between armed civilians and legal authority, his careful plans crumbling into chaos he never anticipated. The confrontation that follows unfolds in the narrow space between herb-scented doorways and fish market stalls, a battle for the soul of a changing society played out in steel and blood. When the fighting ends, the 6th name remains uncrossed on Matsudaira's list, but the hunter has learned a terrible lesson. Even predators can become prey when their victims refuse to die quietly. You're crouched in the shadows of Ueno Park, where ancient cherry trees witness a confrontation that will reshape how violence and justice intersect in Edo's rapidly changing world. The morning light filters through pink blossoms that drift down like snow, each petal landing with the soft whisper of falling hopes. But today these symbols of beauty and impermanence frame something uglier, a wounded predator making his final desperate calculations. Matsudaira limps through the grove, his dark clothing torn and bloodstained from the failed attack at the pharmacy. The invincible samurai who began this campaign of terror now moves like mortal man, his legendary composure cracked by the reality of organised resistance. His sword remains sharp, his skills intact, but something crucial has been damaged. His certainty that the universe supports his mission. Listen to the sound of his laboured breathing mixing with the gentle whisper of wind through cherry branches. You're crouched in the shadows of Ueno Park, where ancient cherry trees witness a confrontation that will reshape how violence and justice intersect in Edo's rapidly changing world. The morning light filters through pink blossoms that drift down like snow, each petal landing with the soft whisper of falling hopes. But today, these symbols of beauty and impermanence frame something uglier, a wounded predator making his final desperate calculations. Matsudaira limps through the grove, his dark clothing torn and blood-stained from the failed attack at the pharmacy. The invincible samurai who began this campaign of terror now moves like a mortal man, his legendary composure cracked by the reality of organised resistance. His sword remains sharp, his skills intact, but something crucial has been damaged, his certainty that the universe supports his mission. Listen to the sound of his laboured breathing mixing with the gentle whisper of wind through cherry branches. Each exhale carries the weight of a world view, collapsing, like watching your favourite streaming service cancel every show you actually enjoyed. The pretty pink petals keep falling, indifferent to the blood they're landing on. Nature's way of saying your drama isn't that special. Behind him, the coordinated sounds of pursuit grow closer. Magistrate forces, volunteer guards, and groups of women who've decided they're done being hunted, the network of resistance has evolved from whispered warnings into something resembling a small army. Matsudaira's list of 20 names has become his own death warrant, and the irony tastes like copper pennies and regret. You watch as he reaches into his kimono and withdraws the blood-stained paper, his twisted manifesto made flesh. 15 names remain uncrossed, 15 women who represent everything he believes is wrong with the changing world. But for the first time since this nightmare began, doubt creeps across his features like shadows at sunset. A child's voice cuts through the morning air, a little girl playing near the pond, unaware that monsters walk among the cherry blossoms. She's maybe 7 years old, chasing butterfly on knees, with the kind of pure joy that belongs to people who haven't yet learned that the world is full of men who murder women for having opinions. Her laughter sounds like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Matsudaira freezes. In his twisted code of honor, children remain sacred, innocent of the crimes he attributes to adult women. But this child will grow up. She'll learn to read, maybe write poetry, perhaps run a business. She'll become everything he's trying to eliminate from the world. The logic spiral makes his hands shake like autumn leaves. "Otu-san!" the girl calls to her father, who's approaching through the trees with the measured pace of someone who knows danger lurks nearby. "Look, the cherry blossoms are falling like snow." She spins in circles, arms outstretched, completely trusting that the adults around her will keep her safe from the monsters that hunt in daylight. The father, a middle-aged merchant whose hands are stained with ink from his account books, spots Matsudaira immediately. His face goes pale as recognition dawns, but he doesn't run. Instead, he steps between the killer and his daughter, with the quiet courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil. "Yuki," he says softly, "go find your mother. Now." But the child is too enchanted by the falling petals to obey immediately. She dances closer to Matsudaira, her small hands reaching up to catch the pink blossoms. One lands on her hair like a tiny crown, and she giggles with delight. "The trees are celebrating something," she announces with the certainty that only children possess. Matsudaira stares at her, his sword half drawn, his entire worldview fracturing like ice in spring. This child, innocent, pure, unmarked by the social changes he's killing to prevent, will someday become a woman. Will she laugh at samurai poetry? Will she run a business? Will she refuse to bow deeply enough to satisfy men who measure their worth by others' submission? The approaching footsteps grow louder. Voices calling coordinates, search patterns, areas to secure. The hunt is closing in, and decisions must be made. Matsudaira looks at his blood-stained list, at the dancing child, at the father prepared to die protecting her. Something fundamental shifts in his expression. Not redemption, but the recognition that his crusade has transformed him into exactly the kind of monster children need protection from. You're witnessing the moment when ordinary courage meets extraordinary evil in a cherry blossom grove that has become an arena for the soul of Japanese society. The merchant father, his name is Kenji, though he's never considered himself anyone special, stands between his daughter and a killer whose very existence represents the death throes of a social order that never quite worked the way people pretended it did. Kenji's hands tremble, but not from fear, from rage. His ink-stained fingers grip a wooden writing brush like a weapon, which would be laughable if the situation weren't so desperate. He's spent his life keeping careful records, balancing accounts, following rules that made sense in a world where everyone knew their place. Now he faces a man who's decided to enforce those rules through systematic murder. Listen to the child's continued laughter mixing with the distant sound of approaching search parties. She's still catching cherry blossoms, still spinning in circles, still believing in a universe where dancing is safe and fathers can protect their daughters from everything that wants to hurt them. Her innocence has become a weapon against Matsudaira's certainty, harder to ignore than any sword. "You're him," Kenji says quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who's already decided to die if necessary. One who's been killing women for refusing to bow low enough. "My wife warned me. She said men like you would rather murder the future than adapt to it." His words hang in the air like incense smoke, beautiful and poisonous simultaneously. Matsudaira's response comes with mechanical precision, as if he's rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in his mind. "Your wife speaks of adaptation as if abandoning natural order is progress. When merchants' daughters reject samurai proposals, when women claim authority over men's arts, When the low mock the high, this is not change. This is chaos. His sword slides another inch from its sheath. But something's different now. The child's presence has introduced a variable Matsudaira never calculated into his equations of honor and revenge. She represents potential, all the futures he's trying to prevent, all the changes he's killing to stop, yet she's also innocence itself, unmarked by the social crimes he attributes to adult women. The contradiction is eating him alive. You watch as Yuki finally notices the tension between the adults. Her laughter fades as she looks from her father's frightened face and Matsudaira's half-drawn sword. Children are experts at reading emotional weather, and storm clouds are gathering fast. "Otu-san," she asks, her voice suddenly small, "why does the scary man have a knife?" The question hits like lightning. From a child's perspective, Matsudaira isn't a righteous reformer or a defender of traditional values. He's just a scary man with a knife who's making her father afraid. The simplicity of that truth cuts deeper than any philosophical argument about social order or women's roles in society. Kenji steps closer to his daughter, his writing brush held like a tiny sword. "Because some people think scaring children makes them strong," he says, his voice gaining strength. "But real strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves. That's what your mother taught me, and what I'm teaching you." The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. A merchant, the class Matsudaira considers beneath samurai dignity, is demonstrating the kind of protective courage that warrior codes claim to embody. A man with ink-stained hands and no sword training is willing to die for his principles, while a trained killer hides in shadows and murders unarmed women. Matsudaira sees it too. The recognition flickers across his face like shadow and light, and for a moment his entire justification wavers. If this merchant shows more honor than a samurai, if this child's innocence reveals the corruption in his crusade, if the very order he's killing to preserve is already dead, then what has he become? The sound of coordinated footsteps grows closer. Multiple search teams converging on the grove from different directions. The net is tightening and the hunter is about to become the hunted. But first he must decide what to do about a dancing child who has accidentally shown him the monster in his own reflection. You're watching the precise moment when a killer's certainty shatters against the reality of innocent laughter, and the sound is more terrible than any scream. Matsudaira stands frozen in the dappled sunlight, his sword half drawn, staring at a 7-year-old girl who has accidentally become the mirror, showing him exactly what he's become. The cherry blossoms continue falling around them like tears from a grieving sky. Yuki takes another step toward the terrifying man with the knife, her child's curiosity overriding the survival instincts that keep adults alive. "Are you bad?" she asks, tilting her head with the kind of directness that makes adults uncomfortable. "You look like my uncle when he drinks too much sake and talks about the old days that were better, but probably weren't." Listen to the way her innocent observation cuts through years of rationalization and self-justification. Children have this superpower. They see truth without the elaborate mental furniture adults build to avoid uncomfortable realities. To Yuki, Matsudaira isn't a noble warrior preserving tradition. He's just another sad man who can't handle change, like a customer complaining about the new self-checkout machines. Matsudaira's face contorts as if he's been physically struck. The comparison to a drunk uncle lamenting imaginary golden ages hits closer to home than any sword thrust, because that's exactly what he is, a man so terrified of irrelevance that he's decided to make the world afraid of him, instead of accepting that his time has passed. Kenji uses the moment of distraction to pull his daughter closer, his writing brush still held defensively. "Yuki, remember what your mother taught you about angry men? Sometimes they're dangerous because they're in pain, but that doesn't make hurting people acceptable." His words are meant for his daughter, but they land on Matsudaira like arrows. The killer's hand trembles on his sword hilt. 20 names on his list, 15 still unrossed, and now a child has casually diagnosed the psychological wound that drives his campaign of terror. He's not preserving honor, he's medicating humiliation with murder. The revelation tastes like ashes and childhood disappointments. You notice the search parties are close enough now that their voices carry through the trees. Commands being shouted, positions coordinated, escape routes blocked. But Matsudaira seems oblivious to the tactical situation, lost in the psychological maze created by a child's innocent question. "Are you sad?" 4 words that have accomplished what swords and strategies couldn't. "She shouldn't have refused me," he whispers. And you realise he's talking about Okiku, the merchant's daughter whose rejection started this nightmare. "I offered her jade. I offered her my heart. I offered her a place beside a samurai's honour, and she chose a rice merchant's gold instead." His voice cracks like dry bamboo. Yuki looks puzzled. "But if she didn't like you, why would you want her to pretend? My friend Taro likes me, but I like playing with butterflies more than boys. Should he be angry at the butterflies?" The logic is so pure it could power temple prayers, and so devastating it makes grown men question everything they've built their lives around. The approaching footsteps stop just outside the grove. Whispered consultations, tactical assessments, the quiet preparations that precede either capture or bloodshed. Matsudaira has moments to decide whether to surrender, fight, or find some third option that doesn't exist, in the rigid codes he's followed his entire life. Instead, he does something unexpected. He looks at his blood-stained list, 15 names representing 15 futures he's trying to prevent, and then at Yuki, who represents all the futures he can't control. The paper trembles in his hands like a dying bird, and for the first time since this madness began, something resembling human emotion flickers in his eyes. "The butterflies," he says slowly, "never hurt anyone." You're crouched behind a massive cherry tree as the grove transforms into a carefully orchestrated trap, with Matsudaira at its centre like a spider who's just realised he's caught in someone else's web. The morning light filters through pink blossoms that seem to glow with their own light, but underneath that beauty lies the systematic precision of a manhunt that has evolved from chaos into something resembling military strategy. Magistrate Hayashi emerges from the eastern path, flanked by 6 Doshin officers whose hands rest casually on their sword hilts. But these aren't the fumbling reactive forces that began this crisis. These men move with the coordinated grace of hunters who have learned their prey's patterns and prepared accordingly. Behind them, you catch glimpses of the women's militia that has formed in response to Matsudaira's campaign, armed with everything from kitchen knives to farming tools. Listen to the subtle sounds of encirclement, the soft whisper of sandaled feet on fallen petals, the barely audible signals passed between search teams, the controlled breathing of people who've accepted that violence might be necessary to end violence. It's like watching nature prepare for a storm, except the storm is human and it's been building for days. Matsudaira finally notices the tactical situation developing around him. His head swivels like a cornered wolf, calculating angles of escape that no longer exist. The hunter who stalked individual women through narrow alleys now faces organised opposition in an open space where his victims have become his predators. The irony tastes like blood and cherry blossoms. Kenji still shields his daughter, but his posture has changed as he realises rescue is imminent. "It's over," he tells Matsudaira quietly. "Whatever you thought you were accomplishing, whatever justice you believed you were serving, it ends here, in front of a child who asked if you were sad." His words carry the weight of a judgment that cuts deeper than any legal sentence. Yuki, still blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding her, continues catching cherry blossoms, but now her innocent play has become something else, a symbol of the futures Matsudaira has been trying to destroy. Every petal she catches represents a possibility he can't control, a change he can't prevent, a world where children grow up free from the rigid hierarchies that shaped his own twisted development. "Matsudaira Nobutakumiya," Magistrate Hayashi calls out, his voice carrying the formal authority of imperial justice. "By order of the shogun's representative in Edo, you're commanded to surrender your weapons and submit to questioning regarding the murders of 5 innocent women." The formal language masks the rage that has been building in every decent person who has learned of this horror. The killer's response comes with the mechanical precision of someone reciting a prepared speech. "I serve a higher justice than imperial decree. When the natural order breaks down, when inferiors mock their superiors, when chaos masquerades as progress, then someone must restore balance through whatever means necessary." His voice sounds like autumn leaves, dry, brittle, dead. But something's changed in his delivery. The absolute certainty that carried him through 5 murders has developed cracks, and through those cracks seeps something that might be doubt. Yuki's innocent questions have planted seeds in ground he thought was frozen solid, and now those seeds are sprouting into uncomfortable truths about what he's actually been doing. You watch as the circle of hunters tightens with patient precision. No rushed movements, no heroic charges, just the inexorable closing of a trap designed by people who have learned that monsters must be caged carefully. The women in the group move with particular focus, their faces showing the controlled anger of people who've been terrorized and have decided to do something about it. One of them, an elderly woman whose bearing suggests she might be Midori, the pharmacist who survived the 6th attack, steps forward with the kind of courage that transforms ordinary citizens into heroes. "You want to restore natural order?" she asks, her voice carrying decades of healing rather than harming. "Then submit to justice. Face the consequences of your choices, like the samurai you claim to be." The challenge hangs in the air like incense smoke, beautiful and poisonous simultaneously. Matsudaira has spent his entire adult life defining himself through samurai codes of honor and courage, but now those very codes demand he accept responsibility for what he's become. The contradiction is eating him alive from the inside. You're witnessing the moment when abstract philosophy collides with bloody reality, and the sound it makes is like breaking pottery, sharp, final, irreversible. Matsudaira stands in the centre of the tightening circle, his blood-stained list trembling in hands that have killed 5 women and failed to kill a 6th. The morning light makes the paper glow like a confession written in fire. The names on that list aren't just words anymore. They're ghosts that have followed him into this cherry blossom grove where children play and fathers protect their daughters from monsters that wear familiar faces. Yuki, the tea house owner who laughed at his poetry. Hanai, the silk merchant who sold beauty to common women. Michiko, the widow who dared continue her husband's business. Sachiko, the calligraphy teacher who corrected his brushwork. Tomoe, the poet who signed her own name to her verses. Listen to the sound of their absence. Conversations that will never happen. Poems that will never be written. Businesses that will never grow. Students who will never learn. Each empty space in the world shaped exactly like a murdered woman, and the weight of that emptiness is finally crushing the man who created it. Reality has a way of collecting debts, and the bill for his righteousness has come due. Magistrate Hayashi takes another step forward, his movement calculated to project authority without triggering violence. "The families of your victims are here today," he says, gesturing to several figures at the edge of the grove. Yuki's nephew, who inherited a tea house that will never recover its reputation. Hanae's sister, who watched her children cry for their murdered aunt. Michiko's elderly mother, who lost her daughter and her grandchildren's inheritance in a single morning. The faces of the bereaved materialize from the shadows like an accusation given human form. They don't scream or weep. Their grief has crystallized into something harder and more terrifying than raw emotion. They want justice, not revenge, and somehow that makes their presence infinitely more damning than any curse or threat. Matsudaira's composure cracks like thin ice under spring sun. For the first time, he's forced to confront his victims not as abstract symbols of social disorder, but as human beings whose deaths have created specific, measurable pain in the world. The tea house nephew who lost his livelihood, the children who lost their aunt, the elderly mother who lost her daughter. Each loss radiates outward like ripples in a pond, touching lives he never considered. "They were corrupting the natural order," he whispers. But the words sound hollow even to him. How do you explain to a grieving mother that her daughter had to die because she ran a sake brewery? How do you justify murdering a poetry teacher to an elderly grandmother who just wanted to see her grandchildren grow up safe? Yuki, still catching cherry blossoms in her small hands, suddenly stops and looks directly at him. "My mama says when people hurt others, it's because they're hurting inside. Are you hurting really bad?" Her question cuts through decades of rationalization like a blade through silk, exposing the wound that has been festering at the center of his soul since Okiku's rejection. The simplicity of the diagnosis is devastating. Not a noble warrior preserving tradition, not a righteous reformer restoring order, just a man so damaged by humiliation that he chose to share his pain with the world through systematic murder. The truth tastes like ashes and childhood disappointments, like every moment he convinced himself that cruelty was courage. One of the women in the circle, you recognise her as one of Sachiko's surviving students, speaks with the steady voice of someone who has transformed trauma into testimony. We've been sharing stories about the women you killed. They're real stories, not the crimes you invented to justify murdering them. Would you like to hear who they actually were? The offer hangs in the air like a sword poised to fall. Matsudaira has spent weeks reducing 5 human beings to entries on a list of social infractions. Now he's being invited to learn their names, their hopes, their contributions to the world he claims to be protecting. The knowledge might be more devastating than any physical punishment. You're standing at the crossroads where murder becomes memory. The abstract crimes Matsudaira invented dissolve in the face of actual human stories told by people who knew his victims as more than symbols of social disorder. The cherry blossoms continue falling like gentle snow, each petal landing with the soft weight of a prayer for the dead. The surviving student from Sachiko's calligraphy school steps forward, her ink-stained fingers holding a piece of rice paper covered in beautiful characters. Sachiko-sensei wasn't just a teacher who corrected your brushwork, she begins, her voice steady as mountain stone. She was raising 3 orphaned nieces after their parents died in a fire. She taught them calligraphy for free, along with 20 other children whose families couldn't afford education. Her crime was believing that beauty should be accessible to everyone. Listen to the way truth lands differently than propaganda. Each detail, the orphaned nieces, the free lessons, the belief in accessible beauty, transforms an abstract target into a human being whose absence leaves specific holes in the world. Matsudaira's face shows the impact of each revelation like physical blows. A middle-aged man emerges from the circle of hunters, Hane's brother, his hand scarred from years of metalwork. "My sister didn't sell silk scarves to mock samurai dignity," he says quietly. "She used the profits to buy medicine for sick children in our district. She'd spend hours creating beautiful things so mothers could afford to keep their babies healthy. Her crime was believing commerce could serve compassion." The pattern becomes clear with each testimony. These weren't women overstepping social boundaries. They were human beings using whatever skills and opportunities they possessed to make life better for others. The charges Matsudaira brought against them exist only in his wounded imagination, projections of his own inadequacy onto targets too dead to defend themselves. Yuki tugs on her father's sleeve, still holding cherry blossoms in her small fists. "Otu-san, why did the sad man hurt the nice ladies who helped people? That doesn't make any sense." Her innocent confusion echoes what every rational person is thinking. How do you explain murder motivated by imaginary crimes? Kenji's answer comes with the weight of someone who spent his life watching human nature reveal itself in more commercial transactions. "Sometimes when people feel small, Yuki, they try to make others smaller instead of making themselves bigger. It's like being angry at butterflies because they can fly and you can't." The metaphor is simple enough for a child, but devastating enough to reduce a killer to silence. Magistrate Hayashi produces a scroll from his robes, official records that transform rumour into documented fact. Matsudaira Nobutaka, son of a minor retainer, reduced to ronin status after his master's death 3 years ago. No land, no income, no marriage prospects, despite numerous attempts. Recently rejected by Okiku, daughter of merchant Watanabe, who chose to marry the son of a rice dealer instead. The clinical details strip away every layer of righteousness Matsudaira has wrapped around his actions. Not a noble warrior preserving tradition, but a failed man who chose murder over accepting that the world had moved beyond his relevance. The kind of person who gets angry at GPS directions instead of learning to navigate change. You watch as understanding dawns in the faces around the grove. This isn't about social order or women forgetting their place. This is about wounded pride metastasizing into homicidal rage, about someone so broken by rejection that he decided to punish every woman who dared to exist independently of male approval. Midori, the pharmacist who survived his attack, steps forward with the calm authority of someone who has spent decades healing rather than harming. "The saddest part," she says, is that if you had channeled your pain into helping others instead of hurting them, you might have found the purpose you've been seeking. Instead, you chose to become exactly the kind of man children need protection from. The judgment is final, complete, devastating in its accuracy. Matsudaira has transformed himself from a failed samurai into a successful monster, and the price of that transformation is standing in a cherry blossom grove surrounded by people who see him exactly as he is. Not a righteous reformer, but a killer whose victims were better people than he ever managed to become. You're witnessing the psychological equivalent of watching a carefully constructed building collapse in slow motion, each flaw of self-justification crashing into the next until nothing remains but rubble, and the sound of something fundamental breaking inside a human soul. Matsudaira stands surrounded by truth-tellers whose stories have systematically demolished every pillar supporting his campaign of righteousness. The blood-stained list in his hands no longer looks like a manifesto of social correction. It looks like what it always was, a document written by someone whose pain had curdled into poison. The remaining 15 names represent not crimes against natural order, but a wounded man's desire to make the world hurt as much as he does. The revelation sits in his stomach like swallowed glass. Listen to the sound of cherry blossoms falling onto the testimonies of the bereaved, nature's gentle percussion accompanying the destruction of a killer's certainty. Each petal that lands seems to carry the weight of a life cut short, a future stolen, a contribution to the world lost because one man couldn't handle being told no by a merchant's daughter. Yuki, still fascinated by the falling blossoms, reaches out to catch one that drifts toward Matsudaira. Her small hand brushes his sleeve, and the contact seems to burn him like hot metal. He jerks away from the child's innocent touch as if purity itself were a weapon capable of causing him physical pain, which, in a sense, it is. The voices won't stop, he whispers, and you realise he's not talking to anyone present. He's addressing the ghosts that have followed him to this grove. Yuki's laughter became Hane's voice asking why she had to die for selling beauty. Sachiko's students reciting lessons their teacher will never finish. Tomo's poems continuing to circulate despite their author's murder. Magistrate Hayashi recognises the signs of complete psychological collapse. He's seen it before in criminals whose elaborate justifications finally crumble under the weight of reality. Matsudaira-san, he says formally, you're experiencing what we call the price of truth. When you build your life on lies about others, eventually you have to face what those lies reveal about yourself. The formal pronouncement hangs in the air like a death sentence, which in many ways it is. Not a physical death, but the death of every story Matsudaira has told himself about his nobility, his righteousness, his essential worth as a defender of proper order. He's finally seeing himself as others see him, a failed man who chose murder over growth. One of the Doshin officers steps forward with practiced caution, recognizing that cornered predators often make desperate final attacks. But Matsudaira doesn't reach for his sword. Instead, he looks at the list in his hands. 15 names of women whose only crime was existing in a world that no longer needed his particular brand of masculine authority. They were supposed to understand, he says, his voice breaking like thin ice. If women would just... If they would only remember their place, then men like me would still matter. The old ways worked. Honour meant something. Respect was given freely to those who deserved it. The words sound like prayers to dead gods. Desperate appeals to a universe that has moved beyond his comprehension. Kenji, still protecting his daughter while watching a killer's sanity unravel, shakes his head with something approaching pity. The old ways worked for people like you because they forced everyone else to pretend you're important. But pretending isn't respect, and fear isn't honour. You've been mourning the death of something that was never really alive. The diagnosis is brutal in its accuracy. Matsudaira has spent his entire adult life grieving a fantasy version of Japanese society where his birth automatically granted him relevance, where women existed primarily to validate masculine authority, where respect was inherited rather than earned. The reality check tastes like medicine designed to cure delusions. You watch as the killer's grip on his blood-stained list tightens, his knuckles whitening like old bone. 15 names representing 15 chances to prove that his worldview still matters, 15 opportunities to force the world to acknowledge his importance through terror, if it won't through respect. But even that twisted comfort is crumbling as he realizes that murder has only made him irrelevant in new and more horrifying ways. You're watching a man scroll through a suicide note written in other people's blood, each remaining name on his list now reading like an indictment of his own irrelevance, rather than a catalogue of social crimes requiring correction. The morning light filtering through cherry blossoms illuminates the paper with an almost holy glow, as if the universe itself is demanding he confront what he's actually written. Matsudaira's finger traces each of the 15 uncrossed names, and you can see him remembering the justifications he created for their deaths. Aki, the seamstress who charged too much for her embroidery. Natsuko, the innkeeper's wife who refused to serve sake to a drunk samurai. Chio, the herbalist who diagnosed illnesses without consulting male physicians. Each woman guilty of the same unforgivable crime, living as if his approval were optional. Listen to the way his breathing has changed, becoming shallow and rapid as the weight of planned murders settles on his shoulders like a burial shroud. These aren't abstract enemies of proper order anymore. They're human beings whose deaths would create specific holes in the world, specific grief in the hearts of people who love them. The math of murder has become unbearable. "Tell me about Aki," Magistrate Hayashi says quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has spent decades extracting confessions from people who thought their secrets were safely buried. The seamstress whose crime was charging fair prices for skilled work. What did she do to deserve death? The question hangs in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Matsudaira opens his mouth to recite his prepared justification, her arrogance, her presumption, her participation in the corruption of natural hierarchy, but the words stick in his throat like broken glass. How do you explain to a child that someone deserves to die for the crime of being good at embroidery? Yuki, still catching cherry blossoms with the focused intensity that only children bring to simple pleasures, suddenly looks up at the tormented man whose list contains so many names. "Do you know all those ladies?" she asks, with innocent curiosity. "Are they your friends? Why did you write their names down if you're teased?" The child's questions cut deeper than any prosecutor's cross-examination. Because the truth is that Matsudaira doesn't know these women. Not as individuals, not as human beings with their own hopes and fears and contributions to the world. He knows them only as symbols of changes he can't accept, projections of his own inadequacy onto targets too distant to defend themselves. One of the women in the surrounding circle steps forward, an elderly lady whose bearing suggests she might be Aki herself, the seamstress whose name sits near the top of the remaining list. "I've heard you consider my embroidery prices an insult to proper order," she says calmly. "Would you like to know why I charge what I do?" The offer comes with the quiet confidence of someone who has spent a lifetime creating beauty with needle and thread. Aki's hands show the calluses and small scars that mark decades of careful work, turning raw silk into art that makes ordinary clothes into expressions of human creativity. Her crime was believing her skill deserved fair compensation. Matsudaira stares at her with the hollow eyes of someone watching his justifications dissolve in real time. This isn't an abstract symbol of social disorder. This is a craftsperson whose work brings beauty into the world, whose prices reflect the value of expertise gained through years of practice. Killing her wouldn't restore natural order. It would eliminate something irreplaceable. "My grandmother taught me to embroider," Aki continues, her voice carrying the weight of generations of accumulated skill. "My mother taught me to price my work fairly. My daughter is learning both lessons. If you kill me to preserve your idea of proper hierarchy, you're not restoring tradition, you're destroying it. The real tradition is knowledge passed from woman to woman, creating beauty that outlasts the politics of angry men." The logic is so clear it could power temple bells, and so devastating it makes Matsudaira's entire worldview look like the desperate fantasy of someone who never learnt the difference between respect and fear. He's not preserving Japanese culture, he's trying to murder its most beautiful aspects, because they don't centre his particular brand of masculine authority. You're standing in a grove where the dead have come to collect their debts, where every cherry blossom seems to carry the whispered names of women whose only crime was existing in a world that no longer automatically deferred to wounded masculine pride. The morning light has shifted, casting longer shadows that seem to dance with memories of conversations that will never happen, poems that will never be written, children who will never be taught. Matsudaira's list trembles in his hands like a dying bird, the blood-stained paper now feeling heavier than his swords. The 5 crossed-out names have become anchors, dragging him toward a truth he's spent weeks running from. That murder doesn't restore meaning to meaningless lives. It only adds meaninglessness to the world in very specific, irreversible ways. Listen to the sound of accumulating summons as the gravity of 5 deaths settles over the grove like morning fog. Yuki's tea house shuttered and empty because her nephew can't bear to serve customers in a place where his aunt was butchered for laughing at bad poetry. Hane's silk stall covered in memorial flowers that will wilt and be replaced by fresh grief every day. Michiko's brewery, where the sake still ferments but tastes like sorrow. The surviving family members stand in their circle of witnesses, not demanding vengeance but radiating something worse. The quiet dignity of people who have been irreparably harmed by someone else's inability to accept change. Their presence transforms the grove into a courtroom where the judge is reality itself, and the verdict has already been written in spilled blood. The voices follow me, Matsudaira whispers, and you realise he's describing the psychological price of murder, the way victims' voices continue speaking long after their bodies have been silenced. Yuki asking why her poetry wasn't funny. Hane wondering why her success threatened him so deeply. Michiko questioning why her widowed independence required such violent correction. Yuki, still playing among the falling blossoms, suddenly stops and looks directly at him, with the kind of focused attention children reserve for truly puzzling adult behaviour. My mama says when people hurt others, the hurt stays inside them and gets bigger and bigger until it's all they are. Is that what happened to you? The diagnosis from a 7-year-old cuts through decades of elaborate rationalisation like a blade through silk. Because that's exactly what happened. Rejection became resentment. Resentment became rage. Rage became a systematic campaign to make the world as small and bitter as his own wounded heart. The child has just explained his entire psychology with the clarity that only comes from not yet learning to lie to yourself. Magistrate Hayashi steps forward with the measured authority of someone who has spent years watching human nature reveal itself in all its terrible complexity. Matsudaira-san, the law recognises different categories of killing. There is murder in passion, killing in self-defence, execution in service of justice. But what you have done, systematic murder of innocent people to satisfy your wounded pride, this has no category except evil. The formal pronouncement settles over the grove like a funeral shroud. Not passion, not self-defence, not justice. Just evil dressed up in elaborate justifications about social order and natural hierarchy. The kind of evil that children recognise instinctively because they haven't yet learned the sophisticated vocabulary adults use to disguise cruelty as virtue. One of Sachiko's surviving students produces a scroll covered in her teacher's calligraphy, the last poem the murdered instructor was working on before. Matsudaira's blade silenced her voice forever. She was writing about cherry blossoms, the student says quietly, about how their beauty comes from accepting that all things pass, that trying to stop change only makes you miss the beauty that change can bring. The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. A murdered poetry teacher's final work contains wisdom that might have saved her killer from becoming a monster if he had possessed the humility to learn from someone he considered beneath his station. Instead, he silenced the very voice that might have offered him a path toward a peace with a changing world. Matsudaira looks at his list of remaining names, then at the cherry blossoms falling around him, like snow, then at the child who has somehow become his judge and jury through the simple act of asking if he's sad. The weight of 5 ghosts presses down on his shoulders, and the burden of 15 planned murders feels heavier than any sword he's ever carried. You're witnessing the psychological equivalent of a dam breaking, where years of accumulated delusion finally surrender to the pressure of accumulated truth, and the sound it makes is like prayer bells cracking under the weight of unanswered questions. Matsudaira stands in the centre of a grove that has become his confessional, surrounded by evidence of what he's done and testimony about who he's become. The blood-stained list in his hands now feels like holding hot coals. Painful to grip, but impossible to release because it represents the only identity he has left. Without his role as righteous corrector of social disorder, what is he? Just another failed samurai whose relevance died with the world that created him. Another man who confused respect with fear and tradition with control. Listen to the sound of cherry blossoms falling onto the testimonies of the bereaved, each petal landing with the soft weight of a life unlived, a future stolen, a contribution to the world lost because one man's wounded pride metastasized into systematic murder. The morning light makes each blossom glow like a tiny prayer for the dead. Yuki approaches him again, her small hands full of pink petals, her face showing the kind of pure curiosity that belongs to people who haven't yet learned that some adults are dangerous. "Mister," she says, holding up a particularly perfect blossom, "this one looks sad too. Like you. Maybe if you held something pretty, you'd feel better." The offer of a cherry blossom from a child to a killer, the gesture contains more grace than Matsudaira has shown in months of elaborate justification for murder. Her innocence isn't naive, it's revolutionary, refusing to accept that human beings are incapable of choosing beauty over violence, growth over grievance, healing over harm. You watch as something fundamental shifts in his expression, like watching ice break up on a frozen river when spring finally arrives. The absolute certainty that has carried him through 5 murders develops hairline cracks, and through those cracks seeps something that might be conscience, might be sanity, might be the first moment of genuine self-awareness he's experienced since Okiku's rejection. Magistrate Hayashi recognizes the signs of psychological crisis, the moment when elaborate defenses collapse and leave the person underneath exposed to reality without protection. "Matsudaira-san," he says formally, "you stand at a crossroads. You can continue down the path of murder, complete your list, and die as the monster you've become. Or you can choose differently." The formal pronouncement hangs in the air like incense smoke, beautiful and terrible in its simplicity. Choice. The one thing Matsudaira has been avoiding since this nightmare began, the recognition that every step down this bloody path was a decision he made rather than a fate imposed upon him by social disorder or wounded honour. Kenji still protecting his daughter, while watching a killer's sanity reassemble itself in real time, speaks with the authority of someone who has spent his life watching human nature reveal itself in commercial transactions. "My wife always says that people become what they practice. You've been practicing cruelty, and it's made you cruel, but you could practice something else." The suggestion is so simple it could power monastery prayers, and so challenging it would require Matsudaira to admit that everything he's done for weeks has been the product of choice rather than necessity, that he became a monster not because the world forced him to, but because he decided that being feared was easier than being irrelevant. One of the women in the surrounding circle, you recognise her, as one of the potential victims whose name appears on his list, steps forward with the kind of courage that transforms ordinary people into heroes. "I know you planned to kill me," she says quietly, "for the crime of reading poetry aloud in mixed company. But I'm here now, and you're surrounded by people who believe in justice rather than revenge. What will you choose?" The challenge is direct, immediate, and impossible to rationalise away. Not an abstract philosophical debate about social order, but a specific choice between murder and mercy, between continuing to spread his pain through violence or finding some other way to live with the fact that the world has moved beyond his understanding. Matsudaira looks at the cherry blossom in Yuki's outstretched hand, then at his bloodstained list, then at the faces of people who have every reason to hate him, but are offering him something else instead. The moment stretches like held breath, like the pause between lightning and thunder, like the space between falling and landing. You're watching the moment when a human soul decides whether to fall or fly, where the weight of 5 murders presses against the possibility of choosing something other than hatred as a response to irrelevance. The cherry blossoms continue their gentle descent, each petal carrying the whispered promise that beautiful things can emerge from the acceptance of impermanence. Matsudaira's hand trembles as he reaches toward the blossom in Yuki's palm, and the gesture seems to take enormous effort, as if touching something pure requires dismantling every wall he's built around his wounded heart. When his fingers finally make contact with the soft petal, his face contorts as if he's been burned by an iron that heals instead of harming. Listen to the sound of his breathing as it shifts from the shallow panting of a cornered animal to something deeper, more human. The cherry blossom in his palm seems to weigh nothing and everything simultaneously. A fragment of beauty that represents all the wonder he's tried to murder out of the world, because it didn't centre his authority. "I don't know how," he whispers, and you realise he's not talking about surrender. He's talking about living in a world where his pain doesn't require other people's death, where his irrelevance doesn't demand violent proof of his importance. The confession contains more honesty than all his elaborate justifications for murder combined. Yuki, with the profound wisdom that sometimes emerges from innocence. Matsudaira's hand trembles as he reaches toward the blossom in Yuki's palm, and the gesture seems to take enormous effort, as if touching something pure requires dismantling every wall he's built around his wounded heart. When his fingers finally make contact with the soft petal, his face contorts as if he's been burned by an iron that heals instead of harming. Listen to the sound of his breathing as it shifts from the shallow panting of a cornered animal to something deeper, more human. The cherry blossom in his palm seems to weigh nothing and everything simultaneously, a fragment of beauty that represents all the wonder he's tried to murder out of the world because it didn't centre his authority. "I don't know how," he whispers, and you realise he's not talking about surrender. He's talking about living in a world where his pain doesn't require other people's death, where his irrelevance doesn't demand violent proof of his importance. The confession contains more honesty than all his elaborate justifications for murder combined. Yuki, with the profound wisdom that sometimes emerges from innocence, nods seriously. "My mama says learning new things is scary, but that's how you get better at being alive. Maybe you just need practice being sick without hurting people." Her suggestion is so simple it could power meditation retreats, and so challenging it would require Matsudaira to rebuild his entire approach to existing in the world. The blood-stained list falls from his other hand, landing among the cherry blossoms like a confession written in other people's suffering. 15 names remain uncrossed. 15 women who will live because a child offered him a flower and asked if he was sad. The mathematics of mercy taste like spring rain and second chances. Magistrate Hayashi steps forward with practiced caution, recognizing the signs of genuine surrender. "Matsudaira-san, you will face trial for the murders you have committed. Justice demands accounting for blood spilled, but you have chosen to stop before completing your list. That choice will be noted." His words carry the weight of official process beginning to reclaim control from personal vengeance. The surrounding circle of hunters relaxes slightly, weapons lowering but not disappearing. They've seen what happens when wounded predators make desperate final attacks, but Matsudaira's sword remains sheathed, his hands occupied with a cherry blossom that somehow weighs more than steel. Listen to the sound of temple bells in the distance, no longer tolling warnings but marking the return of normal time to a city that has been holding its breath. The manhunt is over. The killer has chosen surrender over suicide, confession over continuation. The women whose names remain on his list will wake tomorrow in a world where systematic misogyny has been interrupted by the simple question of a child. You're watching the aftermath of a psychological earthquake, where the debris of a shattered worldview settles around a grove that has become both crime scene and confessional. The morning light filters through cherry blossoms that continue their gentle descent, each petal now carrying the weight of the choices made and unmade, lives saved and lost, futures that will unfold differently because one man decided to stop being a monster. Matsudaira sits in formal Caesar position among the fallen petals, his hands empty of everything except the single blossom Yuki gave him. The Doshin officers approach with practiced efficiency, preparing restraints for a killer who no longer resists because resistance requires a certainty he no longer possesses. His surrender tastes like medicine designed to cure delusions. Listen to the sound of justice beginning its slow, formal process of accounting for blood spilled and lives stolen. Magistrate Hayashi's voice carries the weight of legal authority reasserting itself over personal vengeance as he formally charges Matsudaira with 5 counts of murder. The words transform private trauma into public record, individual grief into collective justice. The families of the victims watch with the quiet dignity of people who have endured the worst possible loss and emerge with their humanity intact. They don't demand immediate execution or elaborate revenge. They want the systematic process of law to acknowledge what has been taken from them and ensure it cannot happen again. Yuki, still fascinated by the falling blossoms, approaches the man who will spend the rest of his life paying for the crime of murdering women who dared to exist independently. "Will you remember the pretty flowers when you're sad?" she asks, with the kind of practical concern that only children bring to complex adult problems. Matsudaira's response comes in a voice broken by the recognition of what he's destroyed and what he's failed to become. "I will remember," he promises, and you understand that this is both punishment and possibility, the burden of carrying beauty alongside the weight of unforgivable actions. The city of Edo begins to exhale as news of the capture spreads through the districts like spring wind carrying the scent of cherry blossoms. Women emerge from hiding places, shops reopen their shutters, and the normal rhythms of commerce and community slowly resume. But everything has changed in subtle ways that will ripple through generations. The 15 women whose names remained uncrossed on Matsudaira's list will live different lives now, marked by the knowledge that they were targeted for death simply for being themselves, but also strengthened by the proof that ordinary people can organise to protect each other from extraordinary evil. You follow the procession as Matsudaira is led away through streets lined with cherry trees in full bloom, their petals falling like snow that covers the bloodstains with beauty. The killer becomes a cautionary tale, but the child who offered him a flower becomes something else, proof that even in the darkest moments human beings can choose grace over grievance. The temple bells continue their measured rhythm, no longer marking crisis, but celebrating the return of a city to itself. Justice will take its course through proper channels, but healing has already begun in the simple act of choosing mercy when revenge would have been easier. In the distance, the first merchants begin calling their wares again, voices carrying hope and normalcy through streets that have learned the difference between tradition worth preserving and authority that demands blood to maintain itself. The cherry blossoms continue falling, indifferent to human drama but somehow blessing it anyway. The story ends where it began, with a choice. But now the choice is made by an entire community that has decided some things are worth defending, and the best defense against monsters is refusing to become them in response to fear. The cherry blossoms fell for weeks after Matsudaira's surrender, covering Edo in pink petals that children collected and elders swept away, the eternal cycle of beauty and cleaning that makes life possible. 5 women died because one man couldn't accept that the world had moved beyond his relevance. 15 women lived because a 7-year-old asked if he was sad and offered him a flower. In the end, tradition wasn't preserved through violence. It was honoured through the choice to protect rather than punish, to heal rather than harm, to ask questions instead of providing answers written in other people's blood. The question remains, when your world changes in ways that make you feel irrelevant, will you choose to grow with it or try to drag it back to a time when your pain mattered more than other people's hope? The cherry blossoms don't care about your answer. They'll keep falling either way, but the children catching them in their small hands, they're watching what you choose.